Hello. In this presentation, I'd like you to take away an understanding of what does it mean to be a sign language interpreter. If any of you watched my introduction, you'll know that I continue to be a sign language interpreter and have been for some 30-some years. And so in this presentation, I'll talk to you a little bit about the education that's required in order to be a qualified sign language interpreter. I'd like to explore the role of what an interpreter does when we're talking about an educational context, K-12. And again, I'll expose you to some of the realities of working with an interpreter and talk a little bit about how interpreting can be more effective. So, if you are currently serving a deaf student in your school or in your classroom and you have an interpreter, I think the first thing to make a connection to is this person qualified, and what does it mean to be qualified? Oftentimes, school districts believe that anyone who purports to know some sign language is an interpreter. And so the important thing to take away is that even though somebody has taken one level of sign language, that might be 30 hours, maybe even 2 levels of sign language, that might be 60 hours, that does not make them a qualified language user, nor does it make them an interpreter. And so the quality of language input that you want for the deaf child is a language-rich environment. That cannot happen with somebody who is not qualified and for someone who doesn't have the language skills. So again, if you speak any other languages, I mentioned in another video clip that I speak some French. I've had a lot of French training, and still I'm not very fluent, and this is the nature of language use. So for yourself, if you've taken 1, 2, 3 levels of sign language, again, if you're not using it, if you're not regularly interacting with all kinds of adult users of that language, it's very unrealistic to assume that somebody is fluent in sign language. An interpreter in this province, in Alberta, is someone who's completed 3 years of formal study. So we have an interpreting program at Lakeland College in Alberta, and people typically take the 1-year full-time study, Deaf Studies program, which allows them to learn American Sign Language and become familiar with deaf community, deaf culture, aspects of the community, and so forth. Then, if they become a fluent signer at a certain level, they may be able to interview and come into the interpreting program. Not everyone who takes the Deaf Studies program and completes it is appropriate to become an interpreter. And so that's another piece to think about, is that the person that you're working with have some sign language, and do they have interpreter training? The interpreter training is 2 years, but in some other provinces it's also a degree, that you have an undergrad degree. And by contrast, in the United States, the standards have changed so that everyone who is an interpreter working in a K-12 system must have at least an undergrad degree. So the standards are shifting increasingly, and so no longer is it appropriate for a school system to say, well, we hired this person, they've got 2 levels of sign language, and that provides the student with access. It simply doesn't. In Canada, we have 5 interpreter training programs, and so if you again are looking at CV and somebody says that they've graduated from an interpreter program, it's really easy to determine whether in fact that's an interpreter program or whether they've had some sign language training. Because you just have to go to the professional association, known as the Association of Visual Language Interpreters of Canada. The acronym on the slide is AVLIC, A-V-L-I-C. If you go to their website, you'll see the actual accredited programs in the country. So there's a program in British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. Those are the only 5 programs. So if somebody says that they've come from a different area, then we have to assess that program carefully to determine whether in fact it's an interpreter program. The other piece that's important for interpreters is that they are members of their professional associations. So just like you and I as teachers were required to be members of our professional association, a professional interpreter also holds membership in AVLIC. And again, that can be easily identified through the AVLIC directory. You can see if the person is affiliated nationally with their organization and provincially with the chapter here in Alberta. And for all of those people who've taken an interpreter program, they may have had a practicum or 2 practicums working with deaf children. But what I want you to understand is that none of the programs in Canada have a direct focus on preparing interpreters to work with children. All of the programs prepare interpreters to work with a broad range of deaf adults in the community. So there is no specific content in the interpreting program about understanding teaching processes, structuring lesson plans, modifying instruction, working with teacher talk that I talked about in the last video. None of the programs have that content. It's all adult focused. And so that creates some real challenges again. Even though we say we've got a qualified person, they've got qualifications as an interpreter, but it doesn't mean they have the additional knowledge and skill sets necessary for an academic environment. Some of you may be working with what we know as signing assistants, educational assistants. Typically, educational assistants, again in this province, may have completed some formal training, and typically they may have had 1 level of sign language, 2 levels of sign language, sometimes 3 levels of sign language, unless they are a deaf signing assistant. And so often that means if we were to test them, and there are some standard tests that can be used with people who purport to know sign language. One of those tests is the ASL proficiency interview. And that's possible. It's certainly the interview process that's used to screen people into interpreting programs and to screen them out. And it gives people a numeric value and a description of their language use. And so for people who, again, have level 3, you still want to be able to assess, is that fluent use of sign language, because lots of people who have level 3 are still very much at using word, sign, pivot grammar, and so they're not fluent. And so if that's the nature of the language input that the student has in the classroom, then they will inevitably be at a huge disadvantage, because they will only get perhaps 10% of the classroom experience, and academically they'll fall further and further behind. So there are consequences to having either an assistant or an educational interpreter. And so I spoke in one of the earlier clips around there are some myths, and I'll just remind you about what those myths are. Many school districts feel like, okay, now we've got a qualified interpreter, that means we've got equal access. I just want you to remind yourself that you have different access. You don't have equal access because that child is using a different language, and we're in a classroom that is not designed to be a bilingual classroom. That many people think that sign language is English, and so whatever the interpreter is signing, that must be English, and then the student has access to English. It's not at all how we understand language use. So even though the interpreter may say to you, well, I'm using a form of signed English, I'm using signing exact English, I'm transliterating, it still is a visual approximation of English, and we have no evidence or research that would tell us that that form of English then supports deaf students in learning to read or write. Another myth is that anyone can learn to sign. We simply know that that's not true. And sometimes schools say, but the student is just in kindergarten, so I don't need a qualified interpreter. Really, an educational assistant is just fine. The early years, we need the most qualified people in there, because those are the critical windows of language acquisition period. And so if I then put in somebody who's very not qualified and is not able to represent any of the language use of the teacher, let alone the other students, we've created a language impoverished environment. It's not possible then for that student later to make up some of those gaps. Some students do, but very few of them do. And so the more gaps are present in those early years, the more it impacts then their academic experience and their academic performance, and then their life choices later. Deaf children can watch sign language 6 hours a day and learn language. That's another myth that I talked about in an earlier video clip. And again, passively watching any language is not how we learn a language. I constantly commute between Calgary and Edmonton, and so frequently I'm listening to Spanish on a CD. It means I'm passively listening to it, and so I'm picking up some rote phrases in Spanish, but next time I use it with one of my Spanish colleagues, I can be pretty sure that it won't be understood by them, because I'm not using language in a natural way. The only way we use language is to use it. That's how we learn any language, and the same is true for sign language. So when you think about how often are you calling on the deaf student, how often is that student being able to use language in a natural way, it's not possible to just learn language by passively watching somebody use it. The other myth that happens for many of the schools that I visit is that they say, Deb, our school is completely accessible. And yet when I ask them about what happens on the playground, do you have interpreters there? Do the other kids sign? Do you have a whiteboard for kids to use if they chose to communicate directly with each other? What happens on the playground? Is that accessible? What happens for assemblies? What happens when you have after-school clubs? How about the school clubs or the athletic events? Many times schools tell me, well, we can't afford to have interpreting for those out-of-school events. But if a student is to be part of your school community, then they have to be part of the entire school community, which means accessible for all of those events. And just another word on that one as well too. Sometimes when I talk with schools about parents-teacher interviews, those also have to be interpreted if the deaf student's going to be a participant in it. And often you may have deaf parents who have hearing students in your classroom, and it's not appropriate for their own children to be interpreting those interviews. So when we think about what does it mean to be an accessible school, I really want schools to think carefully about how are we constructing an environment that we think is accessible for our students. Sometimes teachers say, well, all the kids in my class can sign. What that typically means when I go in and explore it with them is that some of their students can fingerspell. They can manually spell A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But that's not language. That's useful for a little bit of peer communication, but it's not accessible. It's not typical language use, and that's what I'm asking you to give some thought to. So interpreting sometimes looks really easy, especially on the hands of somebody who's really qualified. So again, if you're watching any of these clips and you've clicked on the interpreting link, you'll see a very fluent adult user of American Sign Language, a very well qualified interpreter who makes it look very easy. But it's not an easy cognitive task, and it's not an easy physical task. And so basically, interpreters in an educational setting have to be able to figure out what your purpose is, what are you trying to do with students in this interaction, and they've got to be able to figure out also what does that mean from the student's point of view. So they're juggling 2 points of view simultaneously in making language decisions. You're speaking in English, they're going to be using sign language, a different language. They're also using a different language modality or a different language form. So it's not like you're speaking English and I'm speaking French as the interpreter, 2 spoken languages. You're using a spoken language, I'm using a visual spatial language. So what we know about languages is that then you've got what's known as a bilingual classroom and a bimodal classroom. That requires some accommodation on your part, and I'll talk about that in another clip as well. So when everybody has to manage 2 languages, purpose and intent, student needs, teacher needs, then what we've got is a necessity for cooperation. I'll say it that way, in that in order for the environment to be the most successful it can be, all of us have to be cooperating, and that every one of us is an active participant at getting to what does it mean to relay this content, to encourage the student to participate, and to have them interact with it. What we often say to interpreters is, if you don't understand something, you can't interpret it. And yet often when I interview interpreters in schools, they'll talk about some of the content area that they have expertise in, some of the content area that they're acquiring expertise in through their preparation, and some of the areas that they don't have expertise in. So if your school is lucky enough to have more than 1 deaf student and more than 1 interpreter, sometimes it's possible to schedule the interpreters per their strengths, which is great, just as we would staff teaching loads by capacity, by strength. We'd love to be able to do that with interpreters. So one of the other things that you can do is, if you're only working with 1 interpreter, is to have some real honest conversation about that interpreter's own academic experience in the K-12 system. How well do they understand math? How well do they understand physics? How competent are they in the content area? I said earlier that interpreters are not typically trained in the programs to understand teaching processes, and that's a key piece. There are a couple of programs in the United States that train specifically for educational interpreting, but we don't have any of those in Canada. And so if your school is investing in using an interpreter, then I think you're going to want to build in some very particular professional development for the interpreter that you're working with, so that they can start to understand how teachers use language, how they structure teaching, how they sequence material, and how effectively they can prepare for that so that they can do the best rendition, and it will be a rendition of that particular language. Oftentimes schools, teachers, and even interpreters operate on what we call a transmission model of interpreting. What I mean by that is that you say a word and there must be an equivalent sign, and so you just sign that word. That transmission model has been a huge problem for us in education because it, again, feeds into that illusion of inclusion where I look over and I see rapid signing, and so I assume that the student has full access to that. Doesn't mean it's meaningful language use, doesn't even mean it's accurate content, but that transmission model feeds into, you just speak as you normally do, pretend I'm not here, and I'll just keep signing. But the fact that we have an interpreter present has to alter what teachers do, and it definitely alters the educational experience for the student. I said in an earlier model, video clip, that all of us are actively working. We're all co-constructing meaning in the classroom, and so the transmission model has to be one of those beliefs that we let go of in order to understand more accurately what does it mean to process language and what does it mean to interpret. I think I've given you enough of a flavor now to understand that there are consequences that are long-term for deaf students, and so by producing inadequate interpretation for them in the classroom and replicating that year after year, that has consequences then on their academic success as a learner. It has consequences on their own self-esteem, their assertiveness, and it ultimately has consequences on what becomes their post-secondary experience and their employment opportunities. So when we're thinking about constructing environments, we have to pay attention to all of those opportunities so that the student who is deaf has the same level of engagement socially, academically, and intellectually that the other students have. I spoke in the previous video about some of the data from my study, and on this particular PowerPoint I've given you two slides that have pie charts. And one of them talks about effective interpretation, because we did see some samples of effective interpretation and we want to be able to replicate that for the students for whom a mediated education is appropriate. And the interpreting that was more effective is obviously the interpreting where, when we did what's called a think aloud protocol with the interpreters who are processing language through the frame of thinking about teacher intent, teacher goals, and teacher interaction with students. Those three pieces of teacher interaction, when that informs the interpretation is more effective for the student. When interpreters are actively thinking about student needs, student language preferences, student academic needs, when that helps shape what they do with the language from that frame of reference that I said has to be from the student's eyes, when interpreters understand those two elements to framing interpretation, their work is more successful. The second slide that you have, though, contrasts that with ineffective interpretation, and that pie chart helps you to look at what more typically happens in the classroom. Just a few moments ago I said a transmission model. I said that word, sign, word, sign. On this slide you take away the idea that the interpreters who were the least effective are the ones who are predominantly processing language from linguistic issues only. What I mean by that is that those are the interpreters who are saying, I don't know the sign for Ireland, I don't know the sign for nuclear physics, I don't know the word for this, I don't understand this in English. They're processing language at a very lexical level, which results in a very ineffective product for the student. And so there are a number of features that allow us to determine whether interpreting is effective or ineffective. And those two slides will give you some information about what that looks like in the study. But overall, I can tell you that those of the interpreters who are the most successful are the ones who are guided by teacher intent and student needs, and not guided necessarily by linguistic issues. I've given you a couple of case studies in this particular PowerPoint, and so the first one is a case study of a very accomplished deaf student in a gifted and talented program who uses American Sign Language. And I think when you look at the teacher profile, that probably mirrors perhaps your own experience. Brand new to teaching a student who's deaf, and maybe you've had a 15-minute orientation on how to work with a deaf student from the interpreter. And in that case study, we have two very competent interpreters working in the classroom, and it's a high school environment, so 80-minute classes, so they're team interpreting that work, which is to say that they each do about 15 or 20 minutes. In that particular case study, what we see is that even with very, very talented interpreters, They are providing a way for the deaf student to participate in a challenging academic program. But when it comes to the group processes, when we look at the data, the actual classroom interpreting, what we see is that the teacher is not able to manage the turn taking, that there is complete chaos, really. There's lots of overlapping conversation with 15 or 16 students who all have something to say. So that the result is that the interpreters end up signing very, very quickly, so no natural language use, and that it becomes very English-like, even though the students' needs are American Sign Language. And ultimately, the interpreters have to choose who they interpret. So they choose the loudest voices, or they choose the students that they most like or engage with. And they really struggled for the opportunity to produce American Sign Language to English. So when the deaf student wanted to participate in the conversations, again, a very, very bright person, the interpreters struggled because they're not reading the same content, not really quite understanding the same frame of reference, and the context wasn't always clear to them. So what they produced in English was very halting, lots of false starts, didn't look very confident. And so from the hearing students, when we interviewed them, they viewed that student as really unusual. They said, why is he in the gifted and talented program? He doesn't seem very articulate. And all of those interruptions, is what they viewed them as, were a return to topics that were previously canvassed. When I interviewed the teacher in that particular case study, she acknowledged that the other hearing students viewed the student as different. And typically, when somebody's viewed as different, it's not a positive aspect. And so when we think about the social relationships for that student, he wasn't typically sought out as a group partner, even though there were lots of group work activities in that classroom, and therefore had really no meaningful connection to the other members of that particular class. But when I interviewed the student, they talked about the fact that they felt frustrated with the interpreters because they've got lots to say, but they know the interpreters can't do it. They liked the program, liked it much more than the regular program, felt frustrated that the teacher used lots of media, but none of that was captioned, and that they pretty much felt left out, that they were progressing through the material, that they knew that there would be a good academic outcome, that they could pass the content easily, but in terms of a process that they wouldn't feel like they were necessarily socially involved and not necessarily academically engaged either, intellectually engaged by their own processes. I can contrast that with an example from a rural environment where we have a student who's in grade 5, a cochlear implant student who's using signed English and is the only deaf student in a rural environment. Again, has an interpreter with no formal training, so pretty much a signing assistant who basically has learned sign language on their own. And when we did a data count of the actual things that teachers said and what that looked like on the hands of the interpreter, what we found is that there was very, very limited access to the actual content. And we're talking about grade 5, so again, not terribly heavy content compared to a gifted and talented program. So out of what we would call 280 utterances, 280 phrases or sentences, things that the teacher said that were valuable in the classroom, 130 of those in a 50-minute block might have been accurate and effective, able to be processed by that student. It means that the student has less than half of the content in the classroom. It's not what we would want for a deaf student. I think you would agree with me, it's not what we want, and yet that's the reality that many students face. The student is struggling, falling farther and farther behind, and yet their tutor is the same assistant who doesn't have the language skills, let alone the interpreting skills, to be able to tutor. The student reports that she had friends in the early years but doesn't have them now, reports a positive relationship with the teacher, and reports that she's best friends with the teaching assistant. That's her best friend. So again, when I present that as a contrasting case study, again, I think it's a sobering look at what is the reality of what is to be an accessible education. If we were to talk with the school, the teacher and the administrator both think that everything's going great, that really the problem lies in the student, that she's not academically capable, and that the assistant is doing well, and that many of the teaching decisions are now left to the assistant. So this is a problem. in terms of the case study development. And as you read through the slides, I think that you'll see that it's not an ideal environment for learning. And so this is a context where we would say the student is not suited to working with a mediated environment. I'm going to pause there, and when I come back, we'll talk a little bit about what the interpreter's role is in the classroom.